In the heart of the island of Borneo, amidst tropical forests that harbor a wealth of natural and cultural treasures, a dark tragedy rocked Indonesia. In February 2001, the small town of Sampit in central Kalimantan became a bloody battleground, where intertribal harmony collapsed in a blaze of anger and violence. The 2001 Sampit tragedy. A deep wound in the nation's history, it claimed hundreds of lives, destroyed thousands of homes, and forced tens of thousands of residents to flee. What sparked this conflict? How could a peaceful town turn into a sea of flames? And what lessons can we learn from this heartbreaking event? Let's trace the complete chronology of the Sampit tragedy from its roots to its impact, which is still felt today. Sampit, a small town in the East Varangian Regency, was a complex cultural melting pot at the beginning of the millennium. The Dayak people, the indigenous people of Kalimantan, had inhabited this region for centuries, living in harmony with the forests and rivers. They depended on agriculture, hunting, and rich spiritual traditions for their livelihoods. However, since the Dutch colonial era and especially during the New Order era, waves of migration brought other ethnic groups to Sampit, including the Madurese, who arrived through the transmigration program. The transmigration program, designed to alleviate overpopulation on Java, brought thousands of Madurese families to Kalimantan. They cleared new land, built settlements, and contributed to the local economy, particularly in the trade and transportation sectors. However, beneath this progress, the seeds of conflict began to grow. Cultural differences between the collective and spiritual Dayak people and the pragmatic and resilient Madurese community created friction, economic competition, land disputes, and perceptions of injustice deepened the divide. Sampit in the late 1990s was a city that appeared harmonious on the surface. But beneath it, social tensions continued to rise. Minor incidents, such as market disputes or land ownership disputes, often fueled mistrust between communities. No one could have predicted that these tensions would explode into one of the deadliest ethnic conflicts in Indonesian history. The night of February 17, 2001, marked the beginning of the tragedy in Karingpangi village, about 20 kilometers from the center of Sampit. A minor incident sparked widespread chaos. A Dayak villager was attacked by a group of people suspected of being from the Madurese community. Within hours, Dayak homes in Karingpangi were burned, and anger spread like wildfire in the dry season. For the Dayak people, this attack was not just physical violence, but also an affront to their tribal honor. In Dayak culture, an attack on one member of the community is considered an attack on the entire tribe. The Neo tradition. The long-abandoned practice of tribal warfare suddenly returned. Manda traditional Dayak weapons began to be sharpened again, and the sound of war drums echoed through the villages. News of the burning in Karingpangi spread quickly to Sampit. Dayak communities began to gather, fueled by feelings of solidarity and anger. Meanwhile, Madurese communities also armed themselves, feeling threatened by the increasingly uncontrollable situation. What began as a local incident escalated into the threat of a full-scale conflict. On the morning of February 18, 2001, Sampit turned into a battlefield. Mobs from both sides, armed with machetes, spears, homemade firearms, and even traditional weapons, confronted each other in the city streets. Houses were burned, prominent figures were looted, and lives were lost in the horrific chaos. Within days, Sampit was a city shrouded in smoke, blood, and despair. Official data records more than 500 deaths in this conflict. While the actual number is likely much higher, the majority of victims were Madurese. but Dayak communities were not spared the violence. More than 100,000 residents, mostly from the Madurese community, were forced to flee their homes and belongings. Evacuation ships carrying refugees to Banjarmasin, Surabaya, and other ports became symbols of mass suffering. Amid the chaos, tragic stories emerged: families torn apart, children bereaved, and neighbors now hostile to one another. The violence was not limited to Sampit. The conflict spread to surrounding areas such as Palangkaraya and Pangkalan Bun. In some areas, Dayak residents carried out coordinated attacks targeting Madurese settlements. Meanwhile, the Madurese community attempted to defend itself, creating a cycle of violence that was difficult to break. Initially overwhelmed, security forces struggled to control the situation amidst the chaos. The Sampit tragedy was not simply a momentary emotional outburst. It was the culmination of tensions that had been building for decades. Economic competition was one of the main triggers. Many Dayaks feel excluded from economic opportunities in their ancestral homeland, particularly in the trade and transportation sectors, which are often dominated by the Madurese community. This inequality is exacerbated by deep cultural differences. For the Dayaks, land is part of their spiritual identity. The transmigration policy that brought thousands of Madurese families to Kalimantan is often perceived as a theft of ancestral land. Meanwhile, Madurese who arrived as transmigrants struggled to survive in their new environment, often without adequate government support. Perceived injustices from both sides, coupled with weak law enforcement, created a volatile environment. Furthermore, stereotypes and cultural miscommunication exacerbated the situation. The Dayaks viewed their traditions as part of harmony with nature, while the Madurese community was often perceived as more aggressive in trade and economic expansion. These stereotypes, while not entirely accurate, deepened mistrust between the communities. The Indonesian government, initially slow to respond, eventually deployed thousands of Indonesian military, TNI, and police, Polri, personnel to Sampit in late February 2001. Security operations were launched to separate the warring groups and secure evacuation routes. However, the damage was already extensive. Sampit became a ghost town, with streets littered with rubble and houses burned to the ground. Reconciliation efforts began with mediation between Dayak and Madurese community leaders. A peace agreement was signed in the presence of government officials and traditional leaders, calling for a ceasefire and a commitment to coexistence. However, this process was not easy. Many Madurese chose not to return to Sampit, seeking new lives in Java or other parts of Kalimantan. Meanwhile, the Dayak community sought to restore their cultural identity amidst the stigma lingering after the conflict. The government also began evaluating transmigration policies and the management of interethnic relations. Local economic development programs were introduced to reduce inequality, although the results were mixed. In Sampit, life gradually began to recover, but emotional wounds and collective trauma remained. The 2001 Sampit tragedy mirrored the fragility of interethnic relations in Indonesia. This conflict demonstrated how easily cultural and economic differences can trigger violence if not managed wisely. More than 500 lives were lost. Thousands of families were left homeless, and the city lost its harmony. Yet, beneath these wounds lie valuable lessons about the importance of dialogue, tolerance, and social justice. Today, Sampit is trying to recover from its past. Markets are bustling again, and children from various backgrounds play together. Dayak traditional ceremonies and other cultural activities symbolize hope for stronger harmony. However, this tragedy remains a reminder that peace is something that must be continuously protected, nurtured, and fought for. The 2001 Sampit tragedy is not just a story of violence, but also of humanity, courage, and hope for a better future. It is a story of how a community faced its deepest wounds and tried to rise again. As a nation, we are invited to learn from this history to understand that differences are a strength, not a threat, as long as we choose the path of dialogue and mutual understanding. Thank you for watching this journey with us. Let's let history be a teacher, not a burden. Share this documentary to remember and learn from the past. Subscribe and activate the notification bell for more Indonesian history content. See you in the next story. Yeah.